Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Lou, and I hope you're all ready for a exciting, engaging, and insightful day with the NHSDC Virtual Summer Institute. And to kick us off this year, we have a really special treat in the form of our opening plenary, which is a little bit different. We're going to be having a conversation and panel discussion. And this session is called The Power of Data in the Hands of Those with Lived Experience. And we have a diverse lineup of experts, including Norm Suture from the HUD Office of Special Needs and panelists from all different types of backgrounds that I know you'll love hearing from. So all together presenting today, we have Fran Ledger, KJ Kaminsky, Stacy Matthews, Alexa Timerick, Claudine Sapili, Ingrid Granados, and Viviana Arenas. But before we do that, I just want to familiarize everybody with Whova and how this app works, because we really encourage everyone to be active and participating. So you can actively ask questions in the Q&A tab right here in the session screen. And then you can also head over to the chat where you can connect with other attendees and just make some general comments about what you're seeing. And then for anyone here who prefers to have captions available, we have made them simply available by clicking on the caption button at the bottom of this screen. And of course, if you're having any audio problems and you need to dial in, you'll find that information in the chat section. So that's it. That's the start of our exciting day. And I'm going to now kick it over to Stacy Matthews and the panel here. And I hope you all enjoy this really exciting opening. Stacy?
There? Okay. I think you all can hear me. Good morning, good morning, good morning to most of you. Good evening to our friends in Guam who are 14 hours ahead of us. My name is Stacy Matthews. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I'm with the Cloudburst Group, which is a technical assistance provider that supports the great work of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, SNAP's office, and very excited to be able to moderate today's session. I am Black. I live on the land of the Susquehanna people in Jessup, Maryland. I identify as a cisgender woman. I'm happy to share my identities with you because I know that who's in the room matters. I'm going to ask all of our amazing panelists who are listed here on this slide to take a moment and introduce themselves, tell us what their role is, any of their identities that they would like to share, and we're going to go down the list. So we'll actually start with KJ. KJ, can I pass it over to you to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good morning. I'm KJ Kaminsky. Thank you, Stacy. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for joining. As I said, my name is KJ. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Deputy Director for the County of Santa Clara Office of Supportive Housing. I identify as white, of Dutch and Polish descent. I'm queer. I am originally from the Midwest, but have been living in California in the San Jose, Santa Cruz area for the last little over 10 years. And I am on the land of the Muwekma Ohlone. And am I passing it back to you, Stacy?
Introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here today with you all. My name is Claudine Sapili. I go by she, her pronouns. I identify as a Pacific Islander, Samoan to be exact, and I am the Lived Experience and Innovation Director here at Destination Home, a nonprofit in Santa Clara County, California, that focuses on preventing and ending homelessness. And I am on Muwekma Ohlone land, just like KJ. Thank you. Back to you.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ingrid Granados. I use she, her, they pronouns. I'm a Latina of indigenous descent. I come from the Pipil people of Central America, specifically the highlands of El Salvador. For those of you who know the region, I consider myself somebody somebody with lived experience. A couple of other identities I think that are important to me as well as I'm a career person. I'm a child of immigrants. And lastly, I'm a head of my household. And I'm going to pass it on to the next person.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. I appreciate that. Vivi, do you mind going ahead and introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Viviana. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm a Hispanic, or identify as Hispanic, Latin American, Chicana. I was born and raised, well, partially raised in Santa Clara County, and I'm a member of the Youth Action Board in Santa Clara County. I'm also a community activist in Santa Clara County and kind of like nationally too. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vivi. And now I'd like to ask Fran to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I am Fran Ledger. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as queer and trans non-binary. I am white and I'm in the SNAP's office at HUD. And I am also going to take a moment to introduce Norm Suchar, who is not on right now, but he will be shortly. He's having a little technical difficulty, but he's the director at the SNAP's office. But I want us to be able to dive into this presentation. And then once he's on and he starts to join in the conversation, he'll go ahead and do his own introductions. So I will pass it back to you, Stacy.
And thank you to everyone who's here on the panel today. So again, this is the opening plenary to the National Human Services Data Consortium. We're very excited to be with all of you today. And normally you would get a lot of slides for a session like this, but instead we actually are not going to use a lot of slides. You had that intro slide, we'll have some resources toward the end, but instead we're actually going to just have a conversation. Santa Clara has been doing some amazing work and we're going to dig into what that work is today. And we actually wanted to start off, Vivi, asking you about your experience. So the data space, which most of the folks who are joining the call today are part of the data consortium. The data space is one where many are at a state of meaningful and impactful participation, right? They're trying to figure out what does that even mean? Can you share with us, you shared a recent experience in preparation for this, where you had data that was brought and shared to your group. And can you share with us what that experience was like when folks brought the data to you to share it with you?
Sorry, I think you're thinking of the other panelist who wasn't able to make it today, but for me, based off of like what the other panelists said, and also being in other spaces, not necessarily within the Youth Action Board or within Santa Clara County, I found that sometimes people who are representing the data or presenting the data, they use language that's not easily understood across like multiple audiences. And I think that it's important that when you are using language that's not easily understood, that you're able to break it down for your audience and to basically help them to understand and interpret the certain words and the data that you're using, so that way they can use that data and transform it into, you know, language that they can use, or you know, open up their type of vocabulary, and they can use that data to present on their lived experience and to share, like, oh, well, I learned about this. When you're like speaking with county officials, you can share about the data and you can share your lived experience and have that there to support and back up the facts along with your lived experience. So it's not just a story that you're telling, but it's a story that you're telling that has data and it has power behind it.
just talked about that's so critical is that we often think about, we present the quantitative data and we should have some like qualitative data to present with it from a continuum perspective. But how powerful is it to give the data to the people who have lived experience and are sharing their stories and can actually use the quantitative data along with their experience and just equipping folks with the data. That's really powerful. And I hadn't even thought of it from that perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ingrid, you shared in our prep, and I'm going to mention our prep a few times during this because it's been such a pleasure to get to know this community and to have conversations with you to prepare for this session. Ingrid, your group had a very different experience, right? So it wasn't that the data was just sort of brought to you and presented with complicated language, but you were actually able to interact with the data more. And can you share a little bit about that experience? And of course, anyone else is welcome to join in. Ingrid, I'm going to kick it to you to start off, but I think it'd be great if others also joined in the conversation about, what are the best ways that the data has been shared?
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of context for our group. So I was a part of the coordinated entry system redesign process. Our county, our COC right now, it's our COC, it's not all COCs are county-based, is in the process of redesigning our coordinated entry system. We currently use the VS-BDAT, and as somebody who's taken the VS-BDAT, we know it's a very flawed system, right? We know it's a very flawed assessment. So the way that we approach this in the continuum of care was to first lead with the prioritization committee. That prioritization committee is first where we really set forth the values. It was, to be completely honest with you, it did not make sense until like 18 months later where I'm at right now. At the beginning, they told us like, you're going to be part of a committee and then you're going to be part of another, and then that committee is going to be approved. And then you're going to be part of another committee. And then people are going to redesign stuff. And we were like, okay. But it was really a group of people with various lived experiences. At the time when I when I was unhoused, well, I've been unhoused many a times in my life, but the time I think where I was consciously unhoused, I had an 18-month-old and a partner, and we were unhoused in our city that we were born and raised in. So for me, that was an experience as a family, while we had other people there who were maybe single white men, maybe single Black men, maybe an elderly person. So there were different population sets, right, within our group. And I think the way that we were presented with data in just a very kind of formal, general way, but then that started really tough conversations that really showed people's values from the lived experience of what we overcame, right? And we had to, and I'm gonna go back to quoting one of our prioritization committee members, Deborah Townley. I said she's gonna be famous from this quote. We had to really give enough life vests. It was, if the prioritization committee or just this whole system is a Titanic, she said, it's like we got to give life jackets to everybody. And who do we give the life jackets to? Because we don't have enough of them, right? So how do we prioritize the values of who's going to be able to get those life jackets first? Is it just women and children? No, not in our situation. So we actually went back and asked for data that related to the questions that were important to us, to the values that were important to us. And then we were able to have more extensive conversations within the prioritization committee to say, I get that, family, this population, veterans, super important to make sure. This was like really, really one that stuck out to me. Making sure that they're housed, but technically we have resources in this community to do that, right? We have a functional zero here. What does that even mean to people, right? And why is it that we want to prioritize other groups right now as we're changing this process? We looked at disparities, we looked at numbers. I think that we didn't even know were possible to look at. And I think what I really want to highlight is that it empowered all the committee members to make decisions that were based not only on their experience, on their emotions, on what their care for the community, but it was also backed by the evidence that we were given. And I think that really changed. It was very, very difficult conversations, but I think having the data helped us really get through that in a way that we finally got to like some common ground, and it felt great after 6 hours of being in the same room. So we ended after like 6 months with the law all day retreat. So, and even then, I think their transformation of seeing the group at that 6-hour retreat, like be part of the data and really use it in a live, we were in like a county room. We had like boards up. We were part of like really outlining what we wanted to see, the more data that we wanted to bring out so that we can have this passed by and implemented by the COC board. So I'll let anybody else speak on that, but that was my experience then, and we're still going.
Invite Claudine, if you don't mind talking a little bit about your ranking panel experience and the use of data there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the panel that Stacy is referring to is the NOFO review and rank panel. So every year during the NOFO competition, a committee is convened, and it's an exciting opportunity, right? As a person with lived experience, being invited to sit in on those. For me specifically, it's very exciting. I felt like it was my chance to look at what every applicant was doing in our area, what the service providers have been up to, and also I was excited about the chance to look in a little deeper at their policies and procedures, and so the aspect that I didn't really didn't know what to expect from was the data, right? So it started from so not last year, but the year before was the first year I sat on it, 2021. I believe at that time, our COC provided data on bed utilization, and there were also data around program outcomes, and also things like days to housing, exits to permanent housing, unsuccessful exits, increased income, percent of people referred out to services. I didn't know what to expect because I was at a point where I didn't quite know how to integrate all of it. I knew what my responsibility would be as part of the review and rank panel, but I really didn't know, and I feel like I wasn't prepared to figure out how to integrate that data, how to allow the data to inform my feedback and my input in the review and rank process. So once we were at a place where we had established some understanding and like the correlations between the data and the scores that we were assigning to the different applicants, or the different factors for each applicant, then it started to make more sense. But then it also became very burdensome, right? So as a person that is used to being marginalized, not just because of my lived experiences of homelessness and all the other intersectionalities that come with that, also because of my skin color, so it's very eye-opening. Like I went from like having this tunnel vision to just opening wide and going, oh wow, like I can be part of this. I can speak up and recommend changes, not just in the process itself, the review and rank process itself, but then also how the questions are asked on the applications that service providers and organizations respond to. It's so very empowering. And then we were able to, at that time, make recommendations about the data too, because I felt like some of the data that was presented in that first year, it was just presented just to have it be there, but it wasn't really being used, right, to help us make decisions on the ranking part of the process. So our COC responded. Our COC rocks. Like they responded by making immediate changes, like the following year, and that's just one of the changes that they've made. They've made so many other changes based on the feedback from those of us with lived experience. Hope that answered your question, Stacy.
It does. Thank you so much, both of you, for responding to that. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that when you were talking about the changes, right, like there were very specific changes that you all asked for. Can you share a little bit about what those were?
Yes, absolutely. So so during that first year in 2021, one of the requirements that was in place from applicants, right, is submitting their policies and procedures, and then during the review and rank meetings, you know, and discussions, each of the panelists had to review and read through all these policies and procedures. I mean, a lot of you that are on this call are probably government workers. I've been in the military 7 years. I know what reading like through SOPs is like. You know, you just want to like, maybe there was a movie made, you can watch the movie instead of reading. It's just very dry, very boring, you know, kind of a thing. And there's so many applicants, so you have to read through so many of them. And what we started figuring out was what service providers were reporting in these policies and procedures. We were finding that as people with lived experience, right? And we had panelists in our group that were actually receiving services from the service, formerly from the service provider. So we figured out that what was being said on black and white in the policies and procedures were not translating to the ground, right? Meaning boots to the ground. Are they doing these things and delivering these services they're saying they're doing very nicely on the ground to people that are coming in out of homelessness into the different projects that we're asking for funding? So we provided feedback, and we asked for a better process or a better narrative, something that helps us as the panelists understand what the needs of the populations are, the residents being served, and then tell us if those needs, the service providers or the applicants tell us if those needs are being met on the ground, right? Or in the lobbies, or in the whatever, in the facilities. So we were able to, our COC was able to actually make that change immediately the following year in 2022. And being able to witness that change was phenomenal. The second change that was made was actually, and this one here, I was very vocal and very adamant about this change. There's a factor in the application that talks about, or that asks about, participant leadership in service design. And I don't know, for some of you that have been doing this work for a long time, those words probably mean a box on the wall with a feedback box on the wall, right? Where somebody writes in on a little piece of paper something that is either positive or an area for improvement in a program, you know. And what we wanted to know was how are those little information on the little slips of paper on the wall being integrated and incorporated into improvements being made in a project or a program. And that it didn't come across at all. In 2021, I felt like applicants and service providers were reporting it just to report it, just to satisfy this requirement on this factor. And it wasn't good enough for us. Definitely wasn't good enough for me, right? So what I was specifically looking for was, how are service providers integrating feedback, real feedback from real residents that lived there, right, in improving the program? And how are they investing then time into building up those people with lived experience and residents to a place where they can contribute to a development design of a program or an evaluation of an existing program, and then making improvements to it. So what our COC did, and again, I'm going to say our COC rocks, what our COC did was they launched the following year, they launched the Supportive Housing Leadership Group Initiative, where this group started gathering feedback directly from the residents, and then incorporating that into the scoring of this very specific factor, right? So what I'm saying is, the COC, our COC, went above and beyond the traditional status quo, check the box, have a lived experience person on the governance board. Went beyond that, right? We have 2 people during that year. We had 2 people with lived experience on the board. I was one of those people, and now we have 4, right? So this COC then invited people with lived experience to sit on this review and rank panel. And I'm going to tell you right now, all 5 of us have had lived experience of homelessness. No one on that panel was a person that didn't have lived experience. We had a staff member from this organization sit on there to provide support, but most of us had lived experience of homelessness, and they were able to then, the COC said, we want to hear what you got to say. And then after we said it, they immediately did something about it and then reported it back, right? In closing the loop. And I can't tell you enough how very empowering that is, you know. And I'm not just saying all of these things because KJ is on the call. But I'm saying all of these things because this COC has figured out what works. They continue to develop and progress in the direction of including the most important people to include in these processes and decisions being made. And those are the people I'm talking about, obviously, are people with lived experience of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm listening and hearing in both of these accounts a movement from sort of data being this static thing that's presented to data being a voice in the conversation, right? Data being the data being presenced in a way where you can interact with it and you can investigate it and that you can utilize it. And what I'm hearing about the continuum and the shift that you made, policies and procedures are like our promises, right? This is our plan, these are our promises, this is what we say we're gonna do. But very often the practices, what's happening on the front line, don't always connect to that for a number of reasons, right? Sometimes what we've written isn't reasonable, right? It's just not practical to carry things out in that way. It was a great idea. That's not how it's going to function on the ground. But you shifted your evaluation on that metric from what applicants said they were going to do in their policies and procedures to what they were doing and the experiences that people were having, and asking for that information, that data, over what they said they were going to do, right? So it's great to have policies and procedures that say you're doing all the right things, but what's actually happening on the ground and how do we get at that information? And for the COC to respond by designing a method of collecting that information and that data and then utilizing it in the next year is just such a beautiful symphony of data being presenced in a meaningful way, engaging people with lived experience so that you better understand what we should be looking at, and then a system that responds to that. That's high praise for the system, KJ.
Amen, Stacy. Amen. I just had to, yeah, amen. That's Santa Clara County COC right there. Thank you.
That's amazing, KJ. So we just heard about two very different experiences, right? So we had Vivi tell us about sort of data being dropped there with a lot of dense language that wasn't explained, right? That may be the greatest intention of sharing the data, but not really in a way that was accessible necessarily. And then Ingrid and Claudine just told us about amazing data experiences, right? So it's clear that Santa Clara has been making huge strides in data equity and making meaning together, and that there's still room to grow. So KJ, can you tell us more about the general approach to solving homelessness in Santa Clara?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Vivi, Ingrid, and Claudine, all for sharing your experiences. I feel like every time I have one of these conversations, I learn more and gets my mind thinking about other ways that we can improve. But so just a little bit of background about our community. We in Santa Clara County have for many, many years been operating on a collective impact approach in addressing homelessness, with the county, whom I work for, being a part of, but just one piece. So we work with the city of San Jose, who's the largest urban city here in the county, Destination Home, our leading nonprofit partner and a critical part of our system, as well as the Housing Authority. And that approach had really been then helped us set the foundation, but the shift to centering the voices of people with lived experience over the last probably 4 to 5 years, in that still keeping that collective impact approach, but bringing the voice of people with lived experience in a meaningful way has what I think changed the process, the policies, the system most significantly in the most positive way. So You know, we're a data-driven community, always have been, and we've had processes that incorporated data like the rank and review panel for many, many years. But I think that's such a great example of how this shift occurred and the benefit that we've seen across our community, because we've had the rank and review panel for you know, many, many years. We always had one person with lived experience on it, and we did it the same way. And once we said a few years ago, we want a panel with at least the majority of people with lived experience and hopefully all people with lived experience, that's when they came back and said, this isn't the most effective way to do this. We're not getting the answers that we need. We don't actually understand the experiences of people in these programs that led us to make changes. So prior to that, I think, you know, we made tweaks along the way. Those were coming from either board requests or other partners, or maybe our nonprofit agencies or grantees, but nothing as meaningful and impactful as the changes we've made in the last couple of years, when we sort of have intentionally shifted to not having one person with lived experience at the table, but creating space and opportunity for for people with lived experience to be leading this work. And so that happened with both the examples that Ingrid and Claudine shared. And I still think we haven't gotten there in all of the work that we're doing, but every time we make one of those changes, it strengthens it increases the buy-in across our partners, that this is the way that we should be doing our work, because they see those improvements as well. So, and they also, you know, I think pointing out, like, both of those experiences, we kind of started out in a way that wasn't meaningful to the folks at the table, and listened and made improvements along the way. So I think that has been key, is having the folks who are facilitating these sessions, who are designing the processes, to be open to, you know, we may think we know how we want coordinated entry redesign to work, and 6 months into it, it looks completely different of how we thought it was going to look, because we're open to, you know, just listening to the people who are involved, the people who are at the table. How can we make this most effective? How can we have the most voices at the table? And I just feel privileged and honored to be part of that discussion, and able to listen to the feedback that we're given, and have support in the COC and the institutions to make those changes across our system.
About this, and I'm thinking from the data perspective, right? The idea of being data driven or data informed or data centric, right? All of those ideas really are born out of an intention to be less subjective and more objective, to use the information that sometimes is hidden in narrative, you know, where the loudest voice gets to be heard, and using data, the intention often is to ensure that every piece of information is included. But what you really highlighted is the significance of comparing our quantitative data, right, to what people's experiences are, and that experience data actually being so important to understand and qualify all of the other data, right? Like, so it is still data driven, but it's what data are we listening to, looking at, including, incorporating. And I think that is really critical in making this transformation, right, to going from transactional to transformative, right? So going from informed to actually inclusive, right? Instead of saying, like, you know, here's the thing we did, what do you think about it? Including folks, and here's the thing we're thinking of doing, join us in actually designing what that looks like. And it may turn out to be something totally different in the end, because we've included those closest to the problem in the solution, because we've listened to that qualitative experiential data as it relates to the quantitative data. Are there other examples where you can highlight really how that approach has impacted the data and how you experience the data in your community?
Yeah, I think
For everyone, sorry, not just for KJ. I don't mean to put you on the hot seat, but for everyone.
I think I'll start maybe with one other example. We still use all the system performance measures, but when we were developing our strategic plan and bringing all the partners to the table, we also looked at we wanted a document that everyone could relate to, could see themselves in, could see how they could be a part of the solution and the strategy. And not only did we look at data during the development of that and work with folks with lived expertise and all of our stakeholders, but we also developed outcomes that were, I think, tangible, understandable, relatable to the work that we were doing, and really got a few that were honed in on a few that were the most meaningful to folks across our system. Instead of having of course, our performance management work group, we still look at all the system performance measures. We develop local data measures, but as an entire community, in terms of moving the needle and moving things forward, we wanted to identify just a few that you didn't have to be a data expert to understand what we were doing and the impact of our collective work. I think that helped, and now you hear those goals and those outcomes from our partners across the community in a very simple and a simple way, and a way that I think people know whether we're making progress or not. So that was the result of talking to many people in the development of that strategic plan.
Yeah, I want to add something, Stacy. So as you were talking earlier, I was trying to hold back from from blurting out that it's so critical to have a balance between data and narrative, right? Between the quantitative data and the narrative side of things. I mean, and I know that I realize that sometimes that balance is very difficult, but I really think that that's where Santa Clara County sets itself apart. It's not just about the data. Yes, they are data driven, but it's not just about that. There's so many different processes that Santa Clara County has in place that intentionally invites people into conversations, right? So establishing that the narrative part of it, data makes me nervous, just because I feel like anybody and everybody could manipulate the data however they want to manipulate it for their ends, right? And the balance that Santa Clara County brings into the very human centered element that is very much attached to the data, that's the part that gives me confidence, not just as a COC governance board member, but also as a person with lived experience that works in the field, that wow, there's a teetering, right? There's a balance here. And sometimes it goes heavy on one end, on the data end, and sometimes it goes heavy on the narrative end, but it sort of cancels itself out, right? So one of the data elements that came up in the NOFO review and rank panel all the time, and we were always asking about this, like we wanted this data, and that was successful exits to permanent housing, and number 2, percent exits to homelessness, right? So, and when we received that data, we weren't content about just looking at a number. We don't care about the percentage. We care more about what happened to the humans, right? And the way that Santa Clara County set up their process, it provides an opportunity for the service providers to then go into detail into the narrative, right? And allow the narratives to speak to the self-sufficiency goals of residents, right? So if there's a high percentage of people exiting to homelessness, well, what the heck is going on? Can we know a little bit more about this? How does this tie all the way back to those policies and procedures and service providers identifying the very unique needs of the populations that they were serving within the projects, and then tie it back to figuring out, well, where are the gaps at, right? And I really think that our Office of Supportive Housing does such a great job with providing some of that support, like filling in the gap, and we have home base too that helps support those efforts. So there's just this like I visualize what Santa Clara County does as this continual circle. You know, that never ends, right? It continues to go to spin, and the more it spins, the more improvements are made and progress is being made. And my hope is that for people listening in from other communities on this webinar, that my hope is that you all get there someday too. And Santa Clara County can definitely be a model. I mean, we're not perfect by any means. There's still a whole lot of improvements to be made. Those of us that work within our system, we're hard on our county too, you know, because we are always expecting to improve more and more and more to meet the needs of our people that are still suffering out there in homelessness. So thank you, Stacy.
Jay, I really appreciate so much sharing about where Santa Clara County is now and what really critical work you've done to get there. And Claudine, I am a huge advocate. I'm not allowed to really be an advocate, but I am a huge supporter of qualitative and quantitative data, right? That experiential qualitative data that's about sharing experience, sharing the stories, checking the data, the quantitative data, and saying, like, what's the gut check here? Is this really what we think is happening, right? That has, the evidence shows that this really brings us to a system that's being designed by, for, and with folks, and that improves experiences and outcomes. So you are singing my song. So it's obvious Santa Clara has it going on in terms of inclusion and leadership of people with lived experience, diversification, data equity. But from what you've shared, this hasn't always been the case, right? So we're talking about the leaps and bounds you all have gone over the years to get to where you are. But I'd like to rewind it and take it back. Can you tell us some of the early experiences? What are the lessons learned? How were things in the beginning? What were the challenges? Because a lot of communities are at the very onset of trying to find ways to integrate and meaningfully engage people with lived experience in the data sphere. So I'd love for you guys to take it back a little bit and just share about what it was like in the beginning. What were the challenges? What were the lessons learned?
I think I can speak to that a little bit. Through the Youth Action Board, we're a group of youth and young adults representing folks with lived experience, current or previous lived experience of homelessness. And we came across like some certain times where we were asking questions, and so it was being brought to like the attention of COC staff, like, oh, well, what's the need for like all these questions, and that response, the way that we responded to that was, well, as youth and young adults, we found that when accessing systems and like especially like social services, we experience a lot of like discrimination and judgment. And especially when we're asking like questions regarding like funding or just like the way that the systems work. And there's, I mean, I know many of you probably know, like it's hard to access services, especially like if you have income, you might not be able to qualify because you have income, or if you live with your partner, you may not qualify because your partner makes too much money, or just for whatever reason, like even as a young adult, like, and you're living with your parent, you can't qualify because technically, even if you're above the age of 18, you're not classified as a a independent individual or financially independent, so you still qualify through under your parents. And so there's a lot of barriers that the youth, the young adults face when trying to access resources. And so we found that a lot of the times, and we expressed this as a group, the Youth Action Board, to our COC staff and our support staff and allies, that the reason that we ask questions is because we kind of need to know, like, because we've often been undermined, we haven't been given all the full details, and we miss out on opportunities because we don't know all the details, and it's not transparent communication. Versus if it was transparent communication, we could have more access to opportunity. Our knowledge of like the systems and how the systems work can grow, and we can grow professionally and personally as well. And so I think that having staff in the COC who understands that and who keeps an open mind, so not only having like the lived experience, but valuing the lived experience of people and the voice of the people as well, because we know what's best for ourselves. And if the staff knows that and they also reciprocate that and they believe in that, then they're always going to put your needs first, and they're always going to make sure that your voice is included and incorporated into the decision-making process. And I think I've seen that through like right now I'm the YAB, and as part of the YAB, we're going through the the coordinated entry system redesign, and I'm coming in halfway, but I've seen that they had two other folks, I believe, who were helping through the process, and these two other folks had lived experience. But even coming in halfway, I could see the difference of how the redesign is focusing on the lived experience versus focusing on numerical data. Like I can clearly see, and in just like the one debrief that I've had, I could tell that the language like was designed by somebody who has language that's easily like understood or across multiple audiences. And I really value that, because not everyone understands those fancy words that like political people or people of power use. And I really just value that when the people of lived experience are being put at the front lines and they're creating the solutions themselves, because we've oftentimes been told that we can't, and that we don't know better because of we don't know better because of who we are, or because of what we look like, or because of what we've been through. We don't know better. But at the end of the day, like, we're the ones who are the people who are going to create the solutions, because we know best what we need for ourselves, not the people in political power.
I would love to add some stuff to Vivi. I think she set it up so well. I think we're talking about some really great things about data, and Santa Clara County is very innovative. That's for sure. I've been traveling the country, meeting other COCs for a couple of years now. And I do want to give us credit where credit is due. I also want to point out the reality of data and what people on the folks experience. I think one of the things that we first realized was this lack of accessible language that Vivi is referring to as well. There's an innate distrust towards data. Data has historically been used to continue to perpetuate white supremacist values within two communities that have been marginalized, that are by far the most disenfranchised and the most affected by homelessness. So when you come from that perspective, you already know that this data has been stacked up against you to prove that the failing is yours, not society's, right? And so there is a shift that has to happen, even in your own self, to get over that, to get through the distrust of data, because historically it's been used by people in power who are considered themselves to be professional, more intellectual. And I think we have to really acknowledge that holding that power sometimes takes away, right, from that, it takes away from the validity of what people with lived experience are saying. So if you're going to do that, I would suggest that you make sure that it's real. Meaning that you actually listen to that narrative, to the change that people are talking about, how the data doesn't represent them, how they actually feel distrusted by it. Because I think that that's the magic sauce of what our COC did, right? I'm part of the data think tank. I'm part of the performance management work group. So I live in both worlds of having to look at it in a very quantitative state. And then remembering that the person behind it is myself and my family and my other colleagues and other people with lived experience, right? So I think for myself, even, I think there are a couple of things that I have to remember when I work with people is, how do we flip the data to use it to our advantage? How do we learn to interpret it so that we're asking the right questions to get the data that we actually want? Because like Claudine mentioned at the beginning of this, data can be used many, many ways, whether to be helpful or to be harmful. This is our lesson in the week for my children this week. Are you helpful or are you harmful? And we want things to be helpful, right? So I think it's really important to empower people to also know the language, to understand what it means, right? To interpret it. It makes no sense to give people bar graphs if you don't know what it means, right? If you don't have that knowledge. So there is a learning base, I think, that needs to happen. And I think we also need to be open and liberate ourselves from this idea that we are better because we have the data and we know it than the people who maybe don't, right? Because I don't know how to do my plumbing. And that doesn't mean that like I am better because I'm an intellectual who has a professional job than my plumber, because he sure is going to make my life better, right? So we have to value everybody's experience and everybody's like contribution to like this overall system or your life or whatever it is that you are connecting it to. And I think we like to sit behind computers and we like to interpret all this stuff, but we always need to think about the people that are actually behind it. Even when I look at myself, I'm a number. I'm a number in this system, in the COC. I can look myself up on HMIS right now, but that doesn't accurately represent all the intersectionalities and the experience that I've had as well, right? And I think that we need to keep that in mind, that we talk about data and how we've used it to transform, but never forget that there is a person being represented there as well.
Can I add something very quickly, Stacey? Can I have maybe a minute or so? So because this is, I feel like is very, yeah, thank you. What I feel like is very important, right? So there's a reason why everybody has developed an interest in inviting people with lived experience to be at the table. There's a reason why, and that reason why is because people with lived experience have unique perspectives and a very deep understanding of the issues faced by people currently moving through homelessness, right? So there's that value add that a person with lived experience brings into these conversations and into processes and subcommittees and whatever, right? But what we have to realize, and we don't have this down perfect, and we probably never will because things continue to change. We have to prepare the human with lived experience that you have at the table to give them the skills that they need so they can understand what the heck is being asked of them to do, right? So that includes things like personal and professional development. When somebody is coming out of unsheltered homelessness, for example, and all of us already know this, they're coming in from living in survival mode for years and years and years, right? The things that they worry about are where to get my next meal from, my next water from, how do I hide from maybe an aggressor or perpetrator I've been running from? So they're in survival mode. And then all of a sudden, they move out of the encampment into permanent supportive housing, for example. And 3 months down the line, they're being asked to sit on a board, an advisory board, and they're excited about it. They want to do it. Or contribute in a discussion or a listening session that is evaluating the system of care and then making suggestions to improve the system of care. If the person doesn't know anything about the system of care, how the heck are they supposed to evaluate it, right? And then turn around and make suggestions or feedback to improve that system of care. So what I'm saying is there is a gap, right? We get excited about being in the movement, and this organization where I'm working together with the Office of Supportive Housing, where KJ is, those two organizations got together and decided to create a lived experience advisory board that we now have 6 years in the making, right? So, but what they did was they were very intentional about building in professional development, because it's not lived experience is not enough. And I'll say that again, because I know it'll probably ruffle up some feathers. Lived experience is not enough to have a person sit at the table. That person also needs the support and the skill building and maybe even digital skills, all the things that are needed by the person to be successful. Because you don't want to find yourself at a table and then have people talk and you're like, oh my God, I don't belong here. I don't have a degree, whatever, right? We have to make sure that the person is well equipped to contribute to the conversations, and especially conversations surrounding surrounding data. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
If I could add in really quick, sorry. Along with that, I think it's important that in providing the skills, it's also necessary to provide the resources. So coming out of like the lived experience, you may not have access to a computer, you may not have access to Wi-Fi, you may not even have access to a phone. So sometimes it could be hard to keep in contact or in communication with certain individuals. I found that through the Youth Action Board, that we help with certain things like that, even like childcare. So like if you need childcare assistance in order to be able to go and attend an in-person event, or if you want to take your child with you, you can. Those are both equal opportunities that a member of the Youth Action Board has. Why? Because there's a lot of us of lived experience as young mothers as well, or young parents, or even people who have to take care of their brothers and sisters, because we know that in these types of communities, you may not be a parent, but you may be a caretaker, and we understand that and we value that, because you're doing just as much to be able to be there for your family, and we're supportive of that. And I think that it's necessary that not only do you have people with lived experience come and share their experience, and not only do you teach them how to share their experience or how to be in these spaces, but you show them that you're there to support them by giving them access to the resources that they need in order to thrive, and in order to be present, and in order to be comfortable in that environment.
Just touched on something, right? We often say it's not housing only, it's housing first, right? So the concept of housing first is that it is critical, it is imperative that every person deserves a safe place to live where they can thrive, right? That's the minimum. And then there should be all of these other services available to that person. That's the housing first concept. It's not inclusion only, it's inclusion first. It is imperative that people with lived experience be engaged in the work, but that's not it. It doesn't stop there. You're saying that they need the support to be able to thrive in that engagement. And that includes that stuff that you just described, the childcare, the skill building opportunities, right? I think all of those things, that's a huge lesson learned, right? To start with, let's invite folks in, to move to, not only are we inviting folks in, but we're making sure that it's more than one person. I think you touched on that, KJ, right? Going from like one person on a review board to having the majority of the people on the review board be folks with lived experience. And if you can talk a little bit, KJ, just about that piece of it, of ensuring that, because I think that was one of the critical lessons learned that I would love to elevate here if you have a moment, that it's not just putting one person on your board or having one person be in a setting, but what the actual return is on the investment of having multiple people with lived experience.
Yeah, thank you for elevating that. I think that is probably when like the most meaningful shifts started happening in our processes and our policies. Like when we have allies and peers and power in numbers, not the data numbers, but people numbers, I think that is when we started to really hear honest, meaningful feedback. It's much easier to be critical of the system when you have other peers around you to support too. And so I have learned a tremendous amount when I'm sitting in spaces and welcomed into spaces where it's a majority of people with lived experience, sharing how the system need to change. I think that is that is probably when we started, I think, really hearing more honest feedback. I think the other thing in those spaces when we've made that shift is coming in and saying, not here, we're a bunch of data, I'm a data nerd. I've been living in this world for a long time. I love looking at data. There are things that really speak to me and things that don't. And I have what I think, the pieces of data that I think are really meaningful to me. in the past, I would present those because that was what was meaningful to me. Now I, come to what do y'all want to know? Like, here's what's available. Here's how we collect data. Here's what all of these jargony terms mean. What's meaningful to you? What do you want to know? These are some of the things we collect, but recognizing that either what is meaningful to me may not be meaningful to others, or the way that I present it and understand it may not be the most meaningful to others. So some people like pie charts, other people like box and whiskers, other people like bar charts, whatever it is. I think asking folks and shifting in that moment of like, what do you want to see? How is this most effective to understand and learn from this, so that data can be part of the conversation, and not something that's just presented to in the way that the presenter or the data nerd like myself approaches it. So those I think when we created safe space for people to really shift that conversation, and it wasn't a bunch of people who'd been looking at the same data for 10 years over and over, that was when we started hearing more feedback of how we can either look at additional things that could improve our system, how we can incorporate experiences more into the way we make decisions, really important decisions.
Something I think communities grapple with, right? And I think that's a real clear pathway, because people will say, yeah, well, we invited somebody in and they didn't really say anything, right? Well, invite lots of people in and see if you get a different result, because maybe that solidarity, the kind of support and confidence you get from having identifying folks in the room is what's missing. And I think that's really concrete advice that can help communities move the needle. I want to just welcome Norm Suchar, the Director of the Office of Special Needs Housing at HUD, and put you directly on the hot seat, Norm and Fran. So we're listening to Santa Clara and all of the innovative, amazing ways that they are approaching data and incorporating people with lived experience and placing data. We changed the name of this, right? The power of data in the hands of those with lived expertise. I want to get your reflections on what you're listening to on, and I'll come back with other questions, but let me just start there.
Well, first of all, thank you, and apologies for having some problems getting connected. Again, I'm Norm Suchar. I work with Fran in the SNAPS office here at HUD. We are very data-loving people, and I use he/him pronouns, cisgender white person. And just my main reflection here is this is an amazing conversation, and I'm so glad the audience gets to hear this. And I'm so glad I got to hear it. So thank you so much. Just incredibly rich and nuanced content. It's really amazing. I want to pick out a couple things that I heard that I think are just really important and worth echoing. One is a lot of our challenge as people who work on data is Claudine talked really insightfully about this gap between what people think they're doing or what people sort of promise or say they're doing and the reality of what's actually happening and what people's experiences are. And I think this is our big challenge as people who work on data is how do you do that in a way that's helpful? I think you had a great conversation about how that happens in the context of qualitative data. And I think one of our challenges has always been we get so much data that's sort of a tiny bit of information about a lot of people rather than qualitative data is a lot of information about a few people. But we get all this giant data sets about a whole bunch of people, but how do we translate that into, okay, what's actually happening and what are people's experiences? And how do we close the gap between what people say their aspirations and what they sort of say they're doing and what the reality is on the ground? Because when we look at our data, the one thing that sort of screams out is that most homeless people don't really get any help. This is like, you know, we talk about our programs and how great they are and like how much important stuff they do, but most people don't get into those programs. Like the most common experience is like people are unsheltered or stay in a shelter, and that's about all the help they've gotten. So like, again, how do we use our data to help close, you know, that gap between our aspirations and what the reality on the ground is?
Right?
Yeah.
I'm
Um,
very excited to hear it. And I just wanted to, oh, Ingrid, did you want to say something?
I just had an immediate reaction to what you said. I think when you said like, how do we, I mean, we have to start asking ourselves, who's the problem? Is it the people experiencing homelessness or what we're evaluating, right? Is it the system? Like if we have all this data where people are only getting this minimal services and ultimately not being housed, then why don't we start looking at the data as to why our system is inadequate and not being able to house people, right? I guess what I mean by that is like, I would start asking myself, and I think we have started to ask ourselves, what is the gap that we're finding? Why aren't people wanting to, not wanting to be housed? Why aren't people being housed, right? We oftentimes think they're resistant, they're this or that, but why don't we start asking, what about our system makes it so that people do not have fair and equal access? What about our system is making the VSPDAT have people with a higher acuity in real life, you know, score at a lower acuity? I think that's what first we really need to ask ourselves, because we also choose the data sets that we are looking at, right? So why don't we start looking at the number of places that we actually have in comparison to the rental amounts, or, you know, we have all this stuff. There's plenty of research places that do all these information, right? But I think it's like what we're focusing our energy and time on. And I think since we have all this data, what we now need to start doing is getting away from just looking at the numbers and seeing how we can start really changing that narrative so that we start changing our system.
If I could speak really quickly, Ingrid, I think you kind of answered your own question. I was in a setting recently with Latinas Contra Cancer, and they were talking about numerical numbers, numerical data, like how everyone's always trying to get to the higher number. All of these agencies are putting in the numerical data into like their applications for HUD funding. And when HUD does score, they give back a number and they say, look, you scored this number, but is there people behind those numbers? Is there stories behind those numbers? That's what I think that it's important, is that we need to stop. The numbers are important, but they're only important when the stories that are behind the numbers back up the numbers. So if the numbers have representation, and then that's when they hold value. Also think that a lot of the times that when we're sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think that the numbers are something that we kind of need to stray away from, and they don't always hold the value that we think they hold. As a housing specialist, I've seen as a previous housing specialist, I've seen firsthand that housing first doesn't necessarily work sometimes, because you can house someone, but if you're not going to like, it does work, but if you're not going to support them with the services that they need once they're housed, then they're going to fall back into houselessness. And it doesn't just mean money, like, because I've seen behind the scenes, and I'm not going to name names, but I've seen behind the scenes, like, oh, just say this, or just say this so that they can get the money. But in all reality, if you're not there to support them, and you're not seeing them as a person, and you're not practicing human-centered practices, then you're not really going to support them, and they're just going to fall back into houselessness. So at the end of the day, like, when you're just looking at the numbers, it doesn't help. You need to look at the number like a person, because that's a person behind that number, and that's an individual who needs your help, and they need human connection, and they need support services, not numerical like funding services. Maybe they need like just support services. They need somebody to talk to, or maybe they need a counselor, maybe they need somebody to help them get off their the alcohol or whatever addiction they may have, or get them connected with childcare or whatever services they might need.
Can I quickly add for 30 seconds too? Norm, what you asked is like, how can we change that? And then what I wanted to say was, if we're getting the same numbers, I think we silo the information. We're all looking at just our county. You travel all around the world, the disparities are the same. It's natives and Black people are the most disproportionately homeless. We need to start looking at those numbers across the country and stop just looking at our system. And I don't think that we do that properly. Right? I don't think so. I think what happens is when you're in your own community and you're homeless in your own community, you're looking at just your impact. But when you start to expand it to this larger system in the country, then you're like, wait a minute, we need to start addressing this issue, right? Like, this can't just be my fault or San Jose's fault if everywhere we're sitting the same thing. So I think that's how we start. And I wanted to start with that, but then I got off on this whole tangent about the distress.
So I should say, I totally hear you and agree with you about that. And like, I don't know, Fran hopefully can attest to this, but like, that's what we spend a lot of our time doing. Maybe we're not as effective as we want to be here, but raising the things that are common across communities. And I think the Black and Indigenous disproportionality is like a huge one for us. And we have, many others, and like the housing market sort of situation that's like not just in California, but really all over the country. And, a lot of ways that our systems are failing, but it's common among communities across the country, not just San Jose, not just, wherever. So that is very much the kinds of things we're trying to lift up and to raise awareness about, and to like ensure that Congress is aware and trying to take it into account when they make funding decisions and things like that. And at the same time, like, I think we at the national level are always just sort of like we try to understand the limits of the data we have, right? Like, it doesn't tell a full story about a person. And also, like, the decisions we need to think about, what are the kinds of database decisions you need to make at a national level, and what are the kinds of database decisions that really need to be made at the local level, because there is a different context and a different resources, different skill sets, and different like things that are in a community that mean there should be a different response or a different approach in one community versus another. Or like, communities have just like, some are just really good at housing first, or some are really good at permanent supportive housing, and they really need help in other places, but that's just not the common experience. So we also I think have to be very humble about like, what is our role here, and what can we do at the national level, but then what do we need to do like to strengthen communities and to help communities get it into a better position. So one thing that we're very cognizant of and really have tried to do is to make sure that our incentive to communities is to make sure that the experiences and the voices of people with lived experience and expertise are central to the community strategies going forward. So we like put a bunch of points in our NOFAs, and we like message, and we try to just make sure that's because that's like something, if we're not helping put our putting the more weight on that side of the teeter-totter, that it might not happen. So like, that's something we're very cognizant of and really try to do. And also like that we try to make sure that other people, other systems are bringing resources to the table. Like, where's the child welfare system? Why is the criminal justice system doing all these things that make it harder for people to exit homelessness? Where is mental health and substance use treatment, right? Like, they need to be at the table as well. And so where are the housing authorities, right? We try to like create an incentive structure that brings them to the table, understanding that like, we also need to coordinate at the national level, but there's a type of local planning and coordination that we just can't do at the national level, and that we have to make sure the table is set for that to happen in communities.
There's a couple things I want to touch on. I recognize we only have about 10 minutes left in the session. So I do want, Fran, if you don't mind just kind of sharing, we hear about Santa Clara and the brilliant things that are happening. And Norm just touched a bit on like lifting those lessons from individual communities and trying to spread them and across nationally. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that HUD is doing that? Is that okay? Calling you in for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to talk about that. So we're doing a couple things, you know, wherever we get an opportunity now, we try to infuse kind of community best practices, things that we're learning, where communities have made an intentional shift to include people with lived experience and expertise into their work, and are interested and willing to share those experiences. We've internally to HUD, a lot of our work, we make sure that when we're making a change to things like the 2024 data standards, we had several committees that had a fairly nice, I think, mix of folks that were not just our traditional like advocates and technical assistance providers, but also included people with lived experience and expertise. And we're part of the process to inform what certain data elements look like. And we're fully leaning into that work, and we'll expand that out even further for 2026. And then we have this advanced users group, which is something that existed in the past for HUD, for the SNAPS office, which really tried to take advanced practices that were happening in community around data and performance and allowing these communities to peer share with each other. And then after that kind of initial peer sharing and brainstorming on their projects, to be able to then produce that information out to the rest of the country to be able to share what they were doing. And Santa Clara County has joined in to be one of the kind of rebooted advanced users group communities. So we're very excited about that and to see what they'll be sharing out. So yeah, I'm super excited to see how things have really transformed in the last few years. And it's been, I want to just say I'm very appreciative of the willingness to share the work that you guys have been doing. Yeah, very hopeful.
The East-West workshops, we try so many ways to bring the lessons that we're learning from amazing communities like Santa Clara, including this plenary, to the rest of the country, and looking for ways to even collaborate more meaningfully. I want to spend our last few minutes. There was a lot of love in the chat in Hoover. People are just like cheering everything that they're hearing. But the one question that stands out, and the one thing I want to touch on, is when we're talking about this level of engagement and involvement by people with lived experience, we want to also talk about compensation, right? Because that is such a critical component of ensuring that we're honoring people, that we're treating people as if they're valued, and that we're being equitable in our insurance, that people are being paid for their time. So I'm going to open up the conversation about compensation. What does it look like? Ingrid, I'm going to ask you to talk about that compensation scheme in Santa Clara, so that, you know, it's not just one kind of compensation, right? Like, you guys have multiple ways of compensating folks, and that's based on folks' preferences. And I think that's really something that communities can learn from. And then there's only going to be a few seconds left after Ingrid. We're going to drop some links that HUD has, resources on the HUD exchange in relation to compensation. So Ingrid, if you could go ahead.
Yes, and I'm actually only going to give 30 seconds myself and then pass it to Claudine, because it's a very much of a tag team thing. So what I think I want to emphasize more than anything is that when you people's time is valuable. And when you teach them that to value their time and to properly represent that, you are acknowledging their expertise. And you need to figure out ways to also meet people where they're at in terms of compensation. We are very, very, that's a value that we hold dear to us. And even when, so I am in charge of bringing outside groups oftentimes for our lived experience group. I want to make sure that I'm only bringing opportunities that adequately and fairly compensate them. And then Claudine takes care of the actual compensation. So I'll let her pass it on.
Yeah, thank you for that. Before I touch a little bit on that, Norm, I want to thank you. Right, you said you came in saying that you provide oversight for SNAPs. I was blessed to have had the opportunity to sit on two SRC product lanes, both the program and practice and then also the PLEE lane. And it was my time in the program and practice lane where I co-authored the document. I think Stacy is going to be putting in the chat for everybody, the paying people with lived experience and expertise for participation. So it's amazingly important. I think we don't need to convince anybody of that, right? We all know it's important. One of the things that should definitely be taken into consideration is the fact that if we are saying we value the voices of people with lived experience, well, then when you invite them in to do the work, you pay them equitably and fairly, right? Because a lot of the times I feel like traditionally entities assume or expect that a person with lived experience that may not be already working can come in and sit in this group and not be compensated, right? They just volunteer their time. And I think that's, on that document that was posted to the HUD Exchange, it's both very disrespectful and it continues to perpetuate people's financial problems, right? So I think the key is a very individualized approach. About care, being a mother to young children, and she has this passion and this fire to contribute to all the discussions that are being held by YAB that then inform the processes of the COC. And Viviana deserves to be at that table, right? But in order for her, for example, to be at that table, she needs to have all of these supports in place. So those are the additional costs, right? The reimbursements or whatever you want to call them, but you also have to compensate people for their actual time, right? And it doesn't matter if it's during business hours or after hours. Time is time, right? So, and time is very valuable. So people need to be compensated accordingly. Now, sometimes we would have an expert from a county or a city, or maybe even from HUD that sits at the table and has the conversation about, I don't know, the HMIS data standards, right? Most often and traditionally, the person that works at HUD or with a government entity gets paid a lot more than the person with lived experience that comes in. We'll just pay them a $20 gift card, and that should be fine. That should cover their time. And I think that's BS, right? So compensating people equitably means if the person at HUD is getting paid $70 an hour to be at that table for that hour, the person with lived experience needs equitable compensation at $70 an hour. Is that coming across? Is that making sense? But then there's additional supports needed, right? And additional supports needed is where I'm talking about. Sometimes the people with lived experience don't know how to operate Zoom. There's so many different virtual platforms out there. You send somebody a Zoom link and they can't figure it out, right? Because they don't have a dedicated Zoom account. So things like that, like being very mindful of, and this happens in your individualized approach, right? Really figuring out what is it that this person needs to help them be successful and help them be at the table. And the report back, right? Don't just take the knowledge from the person. That's how tokenization happens, right? Don't just take the knowledge from the person and never get back to them about what has been done with the information you took from their brain. Get back to them and let them know that this is what we heard you, we did this, and we're looking forward to incorporating even more changes down the line. The last thing I want to say about compensation is really look at preference, right? Some people like to be paid by Venmo, some people like to be paid by Target gift cards, by check, whatever the preferred payment method is. And make it a little bit easier for people to choose, right? Make it a little bit easier. If the person needs a W-9, damn it, help the person fill out the W-9 and make sure that they're not entering something in line item 1A because it doesn't need to be there, right? So I think most often than not, we send something out to someone and because we are very well versed in it, we just assume, oh, that person can figure it out. They can go on Google and figure out how to complete a W-9. No, to provide as much support as you can up front, and transparency is key. Be very transparent about what you are expecting the person to do in their lived experience capacity, and make sure they're tracking and they understand what is expected of them. So they can say, yes, I will do it, or no, I really don't feel like doing that this week or this month. So thank you.
Well, that's an absolute
Can
mic drop.
Yeah, it is.
Norm,
And I want to add, I just want to like add, because the issue of compensation is so important. And you said that all just incredibly well. And I just point out that we just published a NOFA last week. So this is like $3 billion. And there's a fairly significant increase in planning funding that's included as part of that NOFO. And one of the things that planning funding can pay for is to reimburse people's lived experience in all these roles we've just discussed. So there's actually resources on the table here that are available. You can people can write us and ask us about sort of the details of this, but there are actual resources that are on the table that people should be aware of. And this is exactly the kind of reason that we have these, is because of the importance of compensating people with lived experience.
Norm, you're preaching to the choir, because KJ will tell you that Santa Clara County used COC planning funds for this very specific purpose. So we're ahead of the game, but we already knew that, right? So thank you.
it feels like a cliff on this conversation, but I want everyone listening to know the conversation does not end here. Santa Clara is participating in the advanced users group, and you will get more. You'll get a white paper, you'll get much more information about what brilliance they're doing. HUD continues to listen to communities, to listen to people with lived experience, to evolve alongside you. And we are going to keep this data conversation going, because it is imperative that we engage people with lived experience in understanding and interpreting data, that we tell the story of folks alongside the numerical data, and that we compensate folks for their engagement in that work. I want to thank everyone for being here at the opening plenary. I am sorry that we could not fit as much of the time, that we had more questions, we had backup questions, but we had such a brilliant, wonderful conversation, and I just cannot thank you all enough. Santa Clara for sharing, HUD for listening and for engaging in this conversation, all of you in the audience for the chat has been going off in Hoover, and we love it. We're going to go in the chat and respond to anything we weren't able to respond to here. So thank you, and I pass it over to Lou.
All right, thank you, Stacy, and thank you, everyone. That was a great opening. And with that, we will end our first session, and be sure to come back in just under 15 minutes for fostering change through data quality. And check out the break we have posted for you. There's a nice way to break up your morning routine. See you soon.